A single sentence, spoken without thinking, was enough to freeze an entire room. "Careful, people would think we're together." The man in the worn gray jacket took a small step backward, the moment the woman beside him stood too close inside the elevator, and for a heartbeat nobody breathed. The doors had only just opened, releasing a rush of cool lobby air into the crowded hallway, and yet the entire floor seemed to pause, caught somewhere between curiosity and disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Around them, junior staff members exchanged quiet glances, assuming he was simply a maintenance worker trying to keep a respectful distance from the most powerful woman in the company. But she only tilted her head, a calm and unreadable smile settling across her face, and answered him with 4 words that would echo through the building for months to come. Would that be bad? No one in that elevator knew that months earlier, she had already begun quietly searching for the one man who had once saved her life. A man who had never asked for credit, never left his name, and never expected to be found. That single exchange, so small it barely lasted 10 seconds, would eventually rewrite the future of an entire company, and the futures of 2 people who had each spent years convinced that love was something meant for other, luckier lives. Ethan Cole had learned, a long time ago, that the safest place in the world was the one nobody noticed. At 38 years old, he moved through the halls of Sterling Tower with the quiet efficiency of a man who wanted nothing more than to finish his shift and disappear before anyone thought to ask him a question. His hands, calloused and precise, carried a toolbox instead of the blueprints they once held, and his uniform bore the faded stitching of a maintenance department rather than the engraved nameplate of an engineering firm. Years before, in another life that felt as distant as a half-remembered dream, Ethan had been one of the most promising structural engineers to graduate from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a young man whose designs had been discussed in university lecture halls and admired by firms twice his age. He had built towers that reached toward the clouds and bridges that people trusted with their lives, and for a while it seemed as though nothing could slow him down. Colleagues from that era still remembered him as the quiet genius who could look at a set of drawings and immediately sense where the weight would fail, a talent so rare that senior partners twice his age deferred to his judgment without argument. He had been engaged to design a suspension bridge in the Pacific Northwest, a project that would have cemented his name among the most respected engineers of his generation. When the winter storm changed everything, and the project passed quietly to another firm, then came the accident that took his wife, a winter storm, and an icy road that no calculation could have prevented, and something inside him simply stopped. He walked away from every blueprint, every award, every voice that begged him to return, choosing instead a life so quiet that even his own reflection sometimes seemed like a stranger. His son, now a grown man building his own life in another state, called every few weeks, and Ethan always answered with the same steady calm, never once mentioning what he had given up. He had found something close to peace in the hum of elevator machinery and the click of a wrench against a bolt, in the predictable rhythm of a job that asked nothing of his heart. Recognition, he had decided long ago, was a currency he no longer wished to spend, because every ounce of praise he had once earned had come attached to a life he could not bear to remember. He preferred the basement corridors of the tower, the quiet maintenance office with its single flickering lamp, the anonymity of a gray uniform that made him invisible to almost everyone who passed him in the hallway. On slow afternoons, when the building settled into its quiet midday rhythm, he would sometimes find himself standing at a window overlooking the city skyline, tracing the outlines of buildings he recognized from another life, wondering briefly what might have become of the young engineer who once believed he could design anything worth trusting. He never lingered on the thought for long, always returning to his work before the memory could take firmer hold. Because dwelling on the past, he had learned, was a door better left closed. Victoria Sterling, 36 years old and already a legend in New York real estate circles, had never once needed anyone to protect her. She had inherited a company built by her grandfather and transformed it into something sharper, faster, and considerably more ruthless than anyone had expected from a woman so young. Reporters called her cold, and she never bothered to correct them, because coldness, she had learned, kept people from asking questions she had no interest in answering. She had never been photographed on a single date, never allowed a rumor to survive more than a news cycle, and never let anyone close enough to see the parts of her that still ached from old wounds she rarely spoke of. Behind every polished headline and every confident boardroom speech was a woman who had built walls so tall that even she sometimes forgot what it felt like to be truly seen. She had taken over the company at 29, following her grandfather's sudden retirement, and had spent the years since proving to a boardroom full of skeptical older men that youth and gender were no substitute for results. She worked longer hours than anyone beneath her, memorized every contract before her lawyers could summarize it, and had earned a reputation for closing deals that seasoned negotiators considered impossible, all while allowing almost no one to see the exhaustion that lived quietly beneath her composure. When she arrived that autumn morning to personally inspect the company's flagship building, her heels striking the marble floor with the practiced rhythm of someone who commanded every room she entered, most of the staff straightened their posture and rehearsed their greetings. Assistants scrambled to align folders, junior executives smoothed their jackets, and even senior partners lowered their voices as she passed. Ethan did neither. He simply kept his head down, tightened a loose panel near the elevator bank, and continued his work, as though the most influential woman in the tower were nothing more than another draft of cold autumn air passing through the lobby. It was a small thing, that indifference, but it was the first thing in a very long time that made Victoria Sterling actually stop and look twice, her gaze lingering on the back of a man who had not once turned to acknowledge her presence. The elevator jammed on a gray afternoon in early November, trapping only the two of them between the 14th and 15th floors. The lights flickering once before, settling into a dim amber glow. Outside the steel doors, muffled voices gathered quickly. Security guards radioing for assistance, while a handful of curious employees pressed close to listen, but inside the narrow box, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, and the low mechanical groan of a system struggling to restart itself. Victoria reached for the emergency panel out of habit, her voice already sharpening with the kind of command she used in boardrooms. But Ethan raised a calm hand and asked her, gently, to give him a moment first. He knelt beside the control box, opened it with practiced fingers, and began speaking to the building's maintenance line in a tone so steady it seemed to lower the temperature of the panic in the room. Victoria watched him work in silence, struck by something she rarely encountered, a man who did not tremble in her presence, who did not stumble over his words or glance nervously toward her the way most men did. 20 minutes passed inside that narrow steel box, 20 minutes during which neither of them spoke more than a handful of words, yet something quietly shifted in the stale, closed air between them. Victoria noticed the steadiness of his hands, the calm precision of his movements, the way he never once raised his voice even as the building's dispatcher grew increasingly flustered on the other end of the line. When the doors finally slid open, releasing them into a hallway lined with anxious employees, Victoria stepped forward without thinking, and found herself standing far closer to him than professional distance allowed. Ethan smiled, an easy, almost boyish smile that softened the tired lines around his eyes, and murmured the words that would follow them both for months. Careful. People would think we're together. Victoria looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the hallway seemed to hold its breath, and then she smiled back, tilting her chin with quiet defiance. Would that be bad? The question hung in the air long after the elevator doors closed behind them. And by the time either of them reached their offices, the entire company already knew something unusual had happened. A young receptionist named Sarah Whitmore was the first to repeat the exchange to anyone who would listen, embellishing the story with each retelling, until the elevator itself seemed to have become a character in the drama. By noon, 3 separate versions of the encounter were circulating through the building, each one more dramatic than the last, and Ethan found himself the subject of curious glances from employees who had never once acknowledged his existence before that week. By the following morning, the rumor had multiplied a dozen times over, passed from one department to another like a secret too delicious to keep still. Some employees whispered that the maintenance manager was deliberately trying to catch the CEO's attention, while others insisted the opposite, that Victoria Sterling had finally found someone immune to her reputation and was testing exactly how far his composure would bend. A few dismissed it entirely, certain that a woman like her would never look twice at a man in a work uniform. no matter how calm his hands were in a crisis. The story traveled through every floor of the building within a single afternoon, whispered over shared elevators and quiet lunch tables, growing more elaborate with each retelling, until barely anyone remembered how it had actually begun. Victoria did nothing to end the speculation. If anything, she seemed to feed it without ever confirming a single detail, stopping by the maintenance office to ask about a flickering light on the 20th floor, inviting Ethan to a brief coffee meeting under the pretense of discussing building safety, requesting his opinion on renovations for a property she was preparing to acquire. Each encounter lasted only minutes, and each one left the office buzzing with fresh speculation, long after she had returned to her tower suite. Once, she asked him to walk with her through an older wing of the building slated for renovation, listening intently as he pointed out load-bearing walls and outdated wiring that most executives would never think to notice. And for a brief stretch of time, she forgot entirely that she was supposed to be running a company rather than simply listening to a man who loved his work more than he let on. Another afternoon, she found an excuse to visit the basement maintenance office herself, staying far longer than any legitimate business required, laughing at something he said with a genuine, unguarded sound that startled even her own assistant when she returned upstairs. Ethan answered every question professionally and left every conversation exactly on time, never lingering, never allowing warmth to slip too far past courtesy. He understood, better than anyone in that building, how quickly a woman in her position could be torn apart by gossip, and he had no intention of becoming the reason for her downfall. Still, each time she walked away, he found himself watching the door a second longer than necessary, and each time he caught himself doing it, he reminded himself why he had chosen a quiet life in the first place. He told himself the attention would fade, that curiosity always did, that within a few weeks some newer scandal would replace him as the subject of hallway gossip. But something about the way Victoria Sterling looked at him, patient and unbothered by the whispers trailing behind her, made him suspect this particular curiosity might not fade quite as quickly as he hoped, and some quiet, guarded part of him was not entirely sorry about that. The trouble began 3 weeks later, when Victoria prepared to sign off on a multi-billion-dollar development project that would define the skyline of Lower Manhattan for the next 50 years. Ethan, called in to inspect a routine maintenance issue on a lower floor, happened to glance at a set of structural blueprints left open on a conference table, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The steel specifications were wrong, subtly but unmistakably wrong, calculated with a load-bearing formula that would hold steady for the first decade before beginning a slow and catastrophic decline. He traced the numbers twice with his finger, certain he had misread them, but the error remained exactly where he had first found it, buried beneath layers of confident engineering jargon that most people would never think to question. The flaw was subtle, hidden inside a column of figures that looked correct at first glance, a miscalculation in the tensile strength of the steel, supports that would only reveal itself under sustained pressure over many years, long after the original engineers had moved on to other projects and other cities. He pulled out his own notebook, the same worn leather notebook he had carried since his university days, and began recalculating the figures by hand, checking and rechecking each formula until he was certain beyond any doubt. He said nothing at first, uncertain whether raising the issue would be worth the humiliation he knew would follow, but the image of collapsing floors and crushed lives would not leave him alone that night. He lay awake, replaying the numbers in his mind, running the calculations again and again on a legal pad at his kitchen table until the sky outside his window turned pale with morning light. The next morning, he requested a brief meeting with the project's lead engineers, and the moment he began explaining the miscalculation, laughter rippled through the room. A maintenance worker, questioning a team of licensed structural engineers, seemed like a joke too absurd to take seriously. And one senior architect suggested, not quietly, that Ethan return to fixing light fixtures and leave real engineering to people who understood it. Victoria, standing at the back of the room, said nothing in his defense. But she also did not laugh. Her eyes moved instead to Ethan's face, studying the quiet certainty there, the complete absence of doubt in a man being openly mocked by professionals who outranked him in every measurable way. Instead of dismissing him, She quietly requested an independent structural audit before signing a single document, overruling 3 executives who insisted the delay would cost the company millions. The room fell silent at her decision, several executives exchanging uneasy glances, unwilling to argue further against a woman whose instincts had rarely failed the company before. One senior partner, a man named Richard Halloway who had run the engineering division for nearly 2 decades, pulled her aside after the meeting and warned her that entertaining a maintenance worker's opinion over his own certified team could damage her credibility with investors. Victoria only thanked him for his concern and told him, in the same even tone she used for every difficult conversation, that she intended to trust the numbers rather than the titles attached to them. The results arrived 11 days later, delivered in a thick manila folder that landed on Victoria's desk just before sunset, and they confirmed every word Ethan had spoken. The independent auditors had found the exact flaw he described, a calculation error that could have collapsed the entire structure within 15 years of completion, endangering thousands of lives and costing the company far more than the delay ever could have. The same engineers who had mocked him now avoided his eyes entirely, suddenly finding urgent reasons to leave meetings the moment he entered them, and the tower that never would have existed under the original design became known, quietly, as the building Ethan Cole had saved before it was ever built. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere around him shifted in ways he had not anticipated and did not particularly welcome. Employees who had never spoken to him before now greeted him by name in the hallways, and a few of the younger engineers began seeking him out during lunch breaks, hungry for the kind of insight that no textbook could teach them. Richard Halloway, the very executive who had warned Victoria against trusting him, eventually approached Ethan privately and offered a quiet, awkward apology, admitting that he had let pride cloud judgment he should have trusted. Ethan accepted the apology graciously, without any hint of triumph. Because vindication, he had learned long ago, meant very little to a man who had never wanted the spotlight in the first place. That night, unable to shake her curiosity, Victoria opened a private search into Ethan Cole's history, something she had avoided doing out of respect for his privacy, until his knowledge of structural engineering made the question impossible to ignore. What she found stunned her into a long, uncomfortable silence at her desk, the glow of her computer screen the only light in an otherwise empty office. There he was, 12 years younger in old photographs, standing beside award plaques and university deans, credited on projects that had reshaped city skylines from Boston to Chicago. Article after article praised his precision, his rare instinct for load and balance, his ability to see weaknesses in a structure that no other engineer in the room had noticed. One retrospective piece, written years after his disappearance from the field, speculated about where he might have gone, calling his absence one of the great unsolved mysteries of modern American engineering, a talent that had simply vanished without explanation or farewell. Victoria found herself reading that particular article twice, struck by how confidently the writer had assumed Ethan's story had ended in tragedy, when in truth, it had simply gone quiet. Waiting, perhaps, for the right moment to begin again. She read about his early graduation from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, about firms that had once fought over his talent, about a rising career that seemed destined for greatness before it simply stopped. Then, abruptly, the record went quiet. The articles stopped, the interviews vanished, and a single line in an old industry newsletter mentioned the sudden and unexplained departure of one of engineering's brightest minds following a personal tragedy. Victoria sat back in her chair, staring at the photograph of a younger Ethan smiling beside a woman whose name she now recognized as his late wife, and felt something shift quietly inside her chest. She could not understand how a man capable of shaping entire skylines had chosen instead to fix flickering lights and jammed elevators, asking nothing from the world in return. The more she read, the more the questions multiplied. And the more those questions multiplied, the more she found herself thinking about him long after she should have gone home. She began to notice things she had never paid attention to before. The quiet dignity in the way he carried himself, the careful patience in his voice when speaking to frightened tenants during emergencies, the complete absence of bitterness in a man who had every right to feel cheated by life. For the first time in years, Victoria found herself distracted during meetings that should have commanded her full attention, catching herself sketching idle thoughts in the margins of contracts, instead of reviewing the terms in front of her. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Claire Bennett, who had worked beside her for nearly 5 years, noticed the change immediately, though she was wise enough never to comment on it directly. Victoria told herself repeatedly that her curiosity about Ethan Cole was purely professional, born from gratitude and admiration for a man who had twice protected things she valued. But the quiet flutter in her chest whenever his name appeared on her calendar told a different, more complicated story. Somewhere between the old photographs and the empty silence of her office, Victoria Sterling, a woman who had never let curiosity turn into anything more, felt the first fragile threads of something she was not entirely prepared to name. Victoria invited him to dinner on a Thursday evening, her voice carefully casual as she mentioned a quiet restaurant a few blocks from the tower, the kind of place where no photographers waited outside. Ethan declined, gently but firmly, and something in his refusal carried none of the discomfort she expected from a man avoiding her out of dislike. He offered no excuse, only a quiet apology and a promise to help her with whatever building matter had prompted the invitation in the first place, though both of them understood the invitation had never truly been about the building at all. In the parking garage later that week, after another long day that neither of them had planned to end together, Victoria finally asked him why. The garage was nearly empty at that hour, the concrete pillars casting long shadows beneath the buzzing overhead lights, and their footsteps echoed against the silence as they walked toward their cars, neither one quite ready to say goodnight. "I don't care what people think," she told him, her voice quieter than usual, stripped of its boardroom edge and softened by the dim fluorescent light overhead. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I care," he said, "because you're the CEO, and a single rumor could undo everything you've built." It was the first time in years that Victoria had encountered a man who placed her reputation above his own desires, who seemed to genuinely worry about protecting her rather than using her position for his own advantage. She stood there in the cold garage light, watching him walk toward his car, and realized with a quiet, unsettling certainty that she wanted to know everything about him, not because of what he could offer her, but because of everything he had chosen not to take. It was a strange kind of ache, unfamiliar and quietly persistent, the kind that followed her home that night and refused to leave even after she had closed her apartment door behind her. For a woman who had spent years mastering the art of wanting nothing from anyone, the sensation was almost disorienting, and she found herself replaying his words long after the garage lights had gone dark behind her. The memory returned to her slowly, pieced together over several sleepless nights, fragments of a storm from years earlier, surfacing like debris, rising to the surface of dark water. She remembered how young she had still been that night, barely 30, driving home alone from a business dinner along a stretch of highway she had traveled 100 times before without incident. She remembered the screech of tires on a rain-slicked highway, the violent spin of her car as it left the road, the terrifying silence that followed the crash before pain finally announced itself. She remembered a stranger's hands prying open a jammed door, strong and steady despite the chaos, pulling her free from the wreckage seconds before flames began licking at the engine. She remembered his voice, low and calm, telling her she was safe now. And then nothing, because she had lost consciousness before she ever saw his face clearly. For years, that night had remained an unsolved mystery, a debt she owed to a man who vanished before the ambulance arrived and never came forward to claim credit for saving her life. She had searched for him quietly in the months that followed the accident, placing anonymous notices in local papers, asking hospital staff if anyone matching his description had come forward, but the trail had gone cold long before she was strong enough to search properly. Eventually, she had accepted that she might never know his name, filing the memory away in some private corner of her mind, reserved for debts she could never repay. It was an old insurance file, buried deep in her personal records, that finally connected the pieces. A single line, noting the name of a witness who had assisted at the scene before disappearing into the rain. Ethan Cole. Victoria sat frozen at her desk when she found it, the name staring back at her from a page she had read 100 times without truly seeing it, and every quiet, guarded moment she had shared with him over the past weeks suddenly rearranged itself into an entirely different picture. He had saved her life once already, and he had never said a single word. Had stood beside her in an elevator and in a hallway and in a parking garage, without once revealing that they had already met, years earlier, in the worst moment of her life. She confronted him gently, choosing her moment carefully, watching his face as she described the storm, the wreckage, the stranger who vanished before she could thank him. She watched him closely as she spoke, searching for any flicker of recognition, any small betrayal in his expression that might confirm what she already suspected. Ethan's expression did not change, but his silence told her everything. His words refused to confirm, and when she finally asked him directly why he had never come forward, he simply said that some things were not meant to be repaid. He told her that helping a stranger on the worst night of her life had never felt like something that deserved a reward. Only something a decent person did, without needing to be thanked for it afterward. Victoria pressed him gently, wanting to understand why he had never once mentioned it, not during their earliest conversations, not even after weeks of growing closer. Ethan explained that revealing it earlier would have changed the way she looked at him, turning him into a rescuer in her eyes, rather than simply a man she had chosen to spend time with on his own merit. He confessed that some quiet, stubborn part of him had wanted her to know him first as Ethan Cole, the maintenance manager who fixed elevators and kept to himself, before she ever learned he was also the stranger from the storm. Victoria understood, more than he perhaps realized, because she too had spent her entire adult life wondering whether people valued her for who she truly was, or merely for what her name and fortune could offer them. From that moment on, Victoria stopped pursuing him with the tools of her position. Understanding at last that money and status meant nothing to a man who had already given her the one thing that could never be bought, she began arriving at his modest apartment building, instead of summoning him to her office. Driving herself through evening traffic without a driver or an assistant trailing behind her, something she had not done in years. They ate at small, unremarkable diners, where nobody recognized either of their faces, sharing quiet meals over coffee that had long gone cold by the time either of them noticed, talking about nothing important and somehow everything that mattered. One evening he showed her an old sketchbook filled with bridge designs he had never submitted anywhere, structures that existed only on paper. And she turned each page slowly, asking questions with a curiosity that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with wanting to understand the man sitting across from her. She lingered on one particular sketch, a suspension bridge rendered in careful, patient pencil strokes, and asked him softly why he had never built it. Ethan was quiet for a long moment before admitting that he had drawn it the week before the accident, and that finishing it afterward had always felt like a betrayal of the life he had lost, though he could no longer fully explain why. Victoria closed the sketchbook gently and slid it back across the table toward him, telling him only that unfinished things were not the same as forgotten ones, a sentence he would carry with him long after that evening had ended. Another night, caught in a sudden downpour with no umbrella between them, they ducked beneath the awning of a closed bakery and stood shoulder to shoulder watching rain sheet down over the empty street, neither of them in any particular hurry to find shelter elsewhere. She learned to walk beside him after work instead of ahead of him, matching his slower, deliberate pace instead of rushing toward the next meeting, learning for the first time in years what it felt like to simply exist beside another person without an agenda. Slowly, carefully, Ethan began to open the doors he had kept locked for years, telling her about the weight of losing a wife he had loved since college, about the strange guilt of surviving when she had not, about the fear that loving anyone again might mean losing them just as suddenly. He spoke haltingly at first, choosing each word as though testing its weight before releasing it into the space between them, and Victoria never rushed him, never filled the silences with empty reassurance. Victoria never interrupted him during these conversations, never offered empty comfort or rushed advice, choosing instead to simply listen, to let his grief exist in the space between them, without trying to fix what could not be fixed. There was something almost sacred in the way she received his words, a stillness in her that he had never encountered in anyone else. And slowly, over the course of that autumn, Ethan began to feel something he had long assumed was gone from him forever. Tentative hope that perhaps his life was not finished being written after all. He told her. One evening, as they sat on a bench, overlooking the river, about the final conversation he had shared with his wife. Before the storm took her, the ordinary argument about nothing important that he had never gotten the chance to apologize for. He told her about the years he had spent afterward, convinced that his talent for engineering had somehow become tangled up with grief, that every blueprint reminded him of a future he had once imagined building alongside her. Victoria said nothing in response, only reached for his hand and held it in silence as the river moved slowly past them in the fading evening light. And in that silence Ethan understood, perhaps for the first time, that grief and hope could exist in the same heart without one destroying the other. The shareholders' meeting that winter was unlike any Victoria had ever led, her voice steady but unmistakably different as she stood before the room and set aside the usual quarterly figures to speak, instead, about the man who had quietly protected the company from disaster. She told them about the flawed blueprints, about the collapse that would have happened years down the line, about the maintenance manager who had risked ridicule to speak a truth no licensed engineer had caught. The room listened in near total silence, the usual restless shuffling of papers and phones absent for perhaps the first time in the company's history. Even the most seasoned board members, men who had sat through hundreds of quarterly meetings without ever once looking up from their tablets, kept their eyes fixed on Victoria as she spoke, sensing that whatever she was about to say carried more weight than any earnings report ever could. She told them, for the first time publicly, about the storm years earlier, about the stranger who had pulled her from a burning wreck and vanished into the rain without ever seeking recognition, her voice catching only slightly as she described a debt she had carried, unspoken, for years. The boardroom, filled with executives who had once dismissed him without a second thought, rose from their seats in a slow, uncertain applause that grew louder with every passing second, until the sound filled the entire hall. Several of the men who had laughed at him in that early meeting now sat in silence, their faces flushed with something between shame and disbelief. Unable to meet the eyes of the man they had once mocked so freely, Victoria offered him, publicly and without hesitation, the position of senior technical advisor, a role that would allow his talent to finally return to the light after years buried beneath a maintenance uniform. Ethan accepted, not because the title mattered to him, and not because of the salary attached to it, but because for the first time since his wife's death, he felt something inside him ready to begin again. He stood at the front of that boardroom, surrounded by applause he had never sought and never wanted, and felt, for the first time in years, that perhaps the world still had a place for the man he used to be. Later that evening, after the boardroom had emptied and the building had quieted into its usual after-hours stillness, Ethan found Victoria alone in her office, staring out at the darkened skyline with an expression he had not seen on her before, something almost vulnerable beneath the composed exterior she wore so carefully in public. He asked her, quietly, why she had chosen to reveal the accident to an entire room of shareholders instead of keeping it private between the two of them. Victoria turned to face him, her reflection faint in the glass behind her, and told him that she was tired of protecting a version of herself that no longer felt true, that some debts deserved to be spoken aloud, rather than carried silently forever. Snow began falling early that winter, soft and unhurried, settling over the city in a quiet white hush as Victoria and Ethan walked together outside the tower, long after the offices had emptied for the night. The streets were nearly silent, the usual roar of traffic muffled beneath a fresh layer of white, and the two of them walked slowly, unhurried, as though neither wanted the evening to end. She reached for his hand without announcing it, her fingers slipping naturally into his, as though they had done this 100 times before, and Ethan laughed softly under his breath. The sound warm and unguarded, in a way she had never heard from him before that night. Careful, he murmured. The same words he had spoken months earlier in that stalled elevator. People would think we're together. Victoria turned to face him fully, snowflakes catching in her dark hair, and repeated the very question that had started everything between them. Would that be bad? This time, Ethan did not step back. He studied her for a long moment, something soft and certain settling into his expression, before he finally answered her. His voice quiet but unwavering. If it's you, he said, then no. It would not be bad at all. They walked on together through the falling snow, past the glowing windows of a tower that had once separated them by every measure society could invent. And for the first time in years, neither of them cared who might be watching. The rumor that had once scandalized an entire company had finally become the truth neither of them was afraid to admit, spoken openly now beneath a winter sky that seemed to hold no judgment at all. They moved forward, as equals now, a CEO and the man who had quietly reshaped her life twice without ever asking for anything in return. Two people who had each carried private wounds for far too long and had finally found, in each other, the beginning of something worth healing for. The snow kept falling long after they disappeared around the corner, quiet and steady, covering the city in a soft white silence that felt, for once, like the start of something rather than an ending. Somewhere behind them, high above the empty street, the lights of Sterling Tower still burned in scattered windows, indifferent witnesses to a story that had begun with a single careless sentence in a stalled elevator and ended, months later, with two people no longer afraid of being seen together. In the years that followed, neither of them would ever quite agree on which moment had truly marked the beginning. The elevator, the storm years earlier, or the quiet parking garage confession, but both of them would always agree that whatever had started it, they were grateful, in the end, that it had never let them go. Sometimes, on quiet evenings long after that winter had passed, Victoria would find herself standing near the same elevator bank where it had all begun, remembering the exact sound of Ethan's voice, the first time he spoke those careless, fateful words. She never told him how often she returned to that memory, how a single stalled elevator on an ordinary autumn afternoon had somehow become the hinge upon which her entire life had quietly turned. Ethan, for his part, kept the old sketchbook on a shelf in their shared apartment, its pages no longer empty, filled instead with new designs he had finally allowed himself to imagine again, drawings of buildings not yet built, and a future he had once believed was closed to him forever. Neither of them needed grand declarations to know what they had found in each other. Only the steady, ordinary proof of two people who chose, every single day, to stay.